Welcome to All Ask the Questions Around Here, the podcast where we explore life's unexpected intersections. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Elisha. Today, like always, we'll journey from the challenging conversations to the inspiring and lighthearted discussions that connect us all. Let's begin. So we've all done it. Met a young child, asked that loaded, often anxiety-inducing question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And more often than not, the answer is a shrug and a sheepish, I don't know. But maybe kids are onto something that we adults haven't really fully grasped. I once read that a better question might be, what do you want to do when you grow up? It's a subtle but powerful shift, one that frees a child from having to define themselves by a single job or identity. It opens the door to curiosity, flexibility, growth, rather than locking them into this narrow idea of who they are supposed to be. And I remember being home for the holidays midway through med school. I was sitting across from my mom at the kitchen table when I finally said the words that had been weighing on me for weeks. Mom, I don't think I want to go back to med school. I'm not sure I want to be a doctor. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even lecture, panic, or try to talk me out of it. She just calmly looked at me and said, you don't have to be a doctor, but you do have a job to finish, and that's to see the fruit of your hard work. Get your medical degree. After that, you can do whatever you want to do. And in that moment, she gave me something far more valuable than advice. She gave me perspective and agency. She reminded me that identity isn't tied to a title, but that perseverance and completion have their own worth. That finishing something you started doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you've earned the freedom to choose your next move. That brings me to introducing my next guest, Dr. Shaan Patel. He is a founder and CEO of Prep Expert, as seen on ABC's Shark Tank. Prep Expert is a leading education company that has helped more than 100,000 students improve their SAT and ACT scores, get into the top colleges, win over $100 million in scholarships. Dr. Patel raised his own SAT score from average to perfect. Has 20 plus years experience with SAT prep and has authored more than 15 test prep books. A board certified dermatologist. He was named one of Inc. magazine's 30 under 30. And he holds degrees from Yale and University of Southern California. Welcome, Dr. Patel.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And that was a great story about your mother. I'm so glad that she responded that way.
Well, it was very empowering. And as I mentioned, it was all about agency, knowing that, maybe we indeed are wrong about asking people what they want to be, because that certainly wouldn't have necessarily applied to someone like you who simply had a lot of other bright ideas and just decided to jump out of the box and do other amazing things that bring you personal satisfaction and joy. And that's kind of the reason that I'm glad to have you as a guest on my show. Would you familiarize our audience a little bit with your work and where you're from and how you got to the place where you're at right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I'll give some background in terms of how I got here to be both, the owner of a test preparation company, but also a board certified dermatologist, because those two things usually don't go hand in hand. So, the way that I ended up where I am today is a lot had to do very similar to you with my parents' influence. I grew up in my Las Vegas, Nevada. I grew up in my parents' budget motel, very strong and influential immigrant background. My parents came with very little money to the United States, bought this motel, and we lived out of it for the first 16 years of my life. So it was not in a great area. I went to kind of urban public schools, but I was very fortunate that my parents valued education more than anything else. and they really pushed me to, succeed. And that I did. I was always a really good student, got straight A's. However, I was not a very good standardized test taker. On the very first SAT that I ever took, which is, for those who may not know, that's the college admissions exam for United States colleges and universities. And I only scored just barely above average. And so, I had a lot of test anxiety. My parents didn't go to college in the United States. I didn't know the first thing about college admissions, scholarships, any of that stuff. And so I spent hundreds of hours in the library studying for the SAT. And eventually I was able to raise my score to a perfect score.
That was 1600, right? At the time?
Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, it was 2400 at the time. It used to
Oh, it
be they
was.
had an extra 800 section for just like 10 years they had it. Now it's back to 1600 like the traditional. So it was actually harder to get a perfect score. And so, I got that perfect score, and it's something that only 0.02% of all students achieve. And it completely changed my life. I got into some of the nation's top universities. I got a $500,000 in college scholarship offers. And as it relates to my career in medicine, I actually got into many what are called BSMD combined medical programs, which essentially guarantee you acceptance in a medical school directly out of high school. And so that's what I chose to pursue, was to go to the University of Southern California's BSMD program. For listeners in the audience out there, it no longer exists, but there are plenty of other BSMD programs out there that are very similar in nature.
I believe Jefferson is one of them.
Yeah, Jefferson has one. Drexel has many. There's Northwestern, Rice Baylor, Brown University. There's a lot of great ones, but they're very competitive, and you typically need high test scores. So I took that, and I was given a full ride scholarship. So it was a great deal to go there instead of the Ivy League or some of the other opportunities that I had in front of me. And so, I was going through the BSMD program. And in my senior year of college, it just kind of hit me one day. I said, I want to help other students improve their test scores the way that I wanted to when I was in high school. And my original idea was very interesting. I was like, oh, I'm not going to have time to actually start a company or do anything like that. I'll just write a book, it'll be great because I'll write a book. I'll be able to generate some royalties during medical school, help pay off med school that way. And, I had this great idea for the first book by a perfect score. And so I pitched out my book proposal to 100 literary agents and publishers. I ended up getting rejected by all 100. And so, that's when I was like, okay, well, I should go back to the drawing board. And I had written hundreds of pages of content at this point. And so I said, well, why don't, before I go to med school, at least, I'll teach one course with all of this content. Might as well, try my hand at teaching, even if I don't have a book deal. And so, in the very first course that I ever taught, my students had an average score improvement of 376 points. And that's pretty amazing in 6 weeks because that's equivalent of taking a student from the 50th percentile, putting them in the 90th percentile. And so, I was going to med school, so I couldn't teach more courses, but I had a lot of parents who wanted more courses because of our results. And so I began training other instructors to teach my curriculum. And, the rest is basically history.
During med school?
Yeah, so it was it was at the end of the summer before I led to med school. I trained one instructor. Then I think in winter break, I trained another instructor. So it was like every time I had a break, I would train another person to teach my curriculum. So yeah, it was during med school, but it wasn't like while I was attending med school. It was during the breaks.
I do want to retrace a little bit. I want to go back for a second, if you will. You grew up in a motel. You lived in a motel for 16 years. And, and I am an immigrant. We came from Iran, and I'm very familiar with the level of sacrifice that our parents put into and the energy that they put into us. But can you talk a few minutes about what that experience was like. What was your greatest lesson from growing up in that kind of an environment?
I would say I got a lot of empathy growing up in that environment because I grew up, you know, around a lot of people who almost seemed like they were forgotten about by society. They were living in the motel as their primary residence. They were kind of, making ends meet barely, paying weeklies, paying monthlies. They had very little to no money most of the time. Some people were really good people, others were drug addicts. It was really the spectrum that you saw as a child.
A slice of the society.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say that one thing that was interesting as it relates to my story or education is it did make me realize the importance of education because what I would see is many of these people, they dropped out of high school, they never went to college. And so education, just like it was for my father who grew up in a small village in India, it was his path out of the village. He eventually became a pharmacist and then practiced pharmacy as well as owned the motel in the United States. But it was his path, it was education. Otherwise, he would still be living in that village. And for me, I wasn't necessarily living in the motel like all the other tenants, but I was, living, I guess I did live in a motel room technically, but obviously it was my parents' motel. But the idea was I didn't want to fail at education because I could see the negative impact it could have on one's life, working job to job, et cetera. And I'm sure many people who do not go to college have very successful lives as we see all the time. But I saw the other side of that, which is if you don't get a good education, if you don't follow a path, like this is what could happen to you. And
The pitfalls.
yeah, the pitfalls. And so that was very, very, I would say that would be my biggest lesson. But I also had a lot of empathy for these people, they grew up in that environment. They didn't see other options. They were often influenced by, you know, whatever it was in that environment, whether it's drugs, prostitution, gangs, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of empathy as well. But my parents, of course, valued education coming from being immigrants and then coming from India. But I also valued education a lot growing up in that environment.
And then you wrote this book. You had 100 rejections. How did you deal with that? I also think about J.K. Rowling, who got all these rejections with her Harry Potter series. And I wonder for you, what was the driving factor to go back to the drawing board and say, you know what, I'm just gonna adjust my sails.
It was certainly disheartening, getting those rejections, saying, getting 100 no's, either by email or phone call, etc. I even had one, I remember publisher said, you're not a great writer. It doesn't matter what your score is, right? So, I mean, there were people who were really mean about it.
Blunt.
Yeah, very blunt and kind of, it makes you second guess yourself. It makes you second guess your mission. But for me, I think I've always had kind of this underdog mentality where, and it's probably from this immigrant mentality that my parents grew up in, is which, you're going to find a way, you're going to keep pushing and try different things. And so that's what I did. And I would say that that's actually a mark of, not only a great entrepreneur, a great doctor, but also a great person is their ability not to not fail, but it's how they come back from failure and how they are resilient to failure and how they respond to failure. Because a lot of people, I think, when they fail or they get rejected, they give up. And that is when, you lose in a lot of ways. Yeah.
How much of a factor were your parents in your drive to succeed? And do you think were they actively involved in this process with you, or were you kind of on your own to kind of navigate this your way out of this?
I'm actually a new parent myself, and I think about this a lot. I just had a newborn son
Congratulations.
6 months ago. Thank you. Yeah, and so I start thinking more about my parents and how they influenced me, etc. And the more that I realize about parental influence, and the more that I want to teach my son, the real thing that I realize is what happens with parents is it's fewer times is what they ever said to me. Instead, it's the meta example that they showed to me. So for me, the example was really my father. My father, as I mentioned, was a pharmacist. So he would wake up at 5 a.m., go to work at the mail order pharmacy at 6 a.m., work till 2 p.m., come home, have, lunch, then go to he owned a gas station literally 3 doors down. So he'd go work at the gas station from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. Then he'd come back, have dinner at 8 p.m. And then, whoever get hotel guests came for the rest of the night, 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., then be back up at 5 a.m. And that was
That
six,
is a
7 days a week.
grueling schedule. That is a grueling
Yeah,
schedule. Worse than the residencies we've had.
exactly, exactly. So, for me, people are like, well, you're a doctor and entrepreneur, but I saw that archetype in my dad. I already saw he was a pharmacist, a healthcare provider, and he was an entrepreneur and running the gas station and the motel. And he would just work 80-hour weeks. So for me, I think that's where I didn't know it at the time, but it was probably that example that I saw day in and day out of how hard my dad worked and his ability to do two or three things at the same time that led me to where I am today, where I do a couple of things. I don't work nearly as hard, but at different points in my life, I certainly have worked those 80-hour weeks, many residency being one of those in med school and other time, and especially in the beginning of launching the business as an entrepreneur. So there are certain points, and my dad doesn't work like that anymore, but I think everyone has different seasons and chapters where if you really want to be successful, you have to put in the work.
Now, you're also obviously a board certified dermatologist and you run a teledermatology practice. How much of your time do you devote to that?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting in that when I was in med school and residency, I would spend 80% of my time in clinic or studying for medicine, and 20% of my time on the business, which would be on the nights and the weekends. I would come home from med school at 6, 7 p.m., and then I'd work, in the evenings, and then a lot of times on Saturdays and Sundays on my business. Now it's kind of the reverse, where I work 80% on my business and 20% doing teledermatology, typically again on the nights and the weekends. And so that has been very, very, I would say, a gift in that my specialty has been able to, it flourishes on telemedicine. Obviously, I know you're an anesthesiologist, it wouldn't work. Surgeons wouldn't, they can't really do tele. Although I have seen some surgeons now doing the remote surgeries, etc. But I'm grateful that dermatology it worked out. And one of the reasons that I think I was drawn to it was I was in residency during COVID, and during COVID, our entire residency, I would say from March of 2020 through June of 2020, we just did tele. And I realized it's much more efficient, effective for me, but also for patients. I'm able to see a higher volume, et cetera. And then for me, as the flexibility with the entrepreneurship and the business, it works out really well. So yeah, basically it's usually, and I use that ratio a lot, 80/20 throughout my life. It's a very powerful ratio, but yeah, it's 80/20 now.
Dr. Patel, you haven't mentioned your mom, and I want to know what kind of influence did she have on you, or does she still have on you?
Yeah, so my mom has been kind of the backbone of our family. I didn't mention her only because I think that the meta example I got from my dad was probably the work ethic. But for my mom, I would say she was the one who really ingrained that value of education into me, which is, for example, when I was growing up, my parents were, we didn't have a lot of money. So my parents would be very frugal And my mom would always say, "Well, there's two things we'll spend money on, and it's food and education." So those were the two things they were willing to, splurge and spend money on.
The essentials.
Yeah, the essentials. And it was interesting because food makes sense, right? But maybe some families wouldn't necessarily always prioritize education. But in this case, my mom was really saying, this is the one investment that really makes sense. So again, I think it was that theme of my mom valuing education, my dad showing the meta example of, this is what it takes to be successful as a healthcare provider and entrepreneur. And those two things together were very, very powerful for me.
Let's go back to your brainchild and let's talk about your experience with the Shark Tank. Can you talk to me a little bit about the process leading up to that?
It's very interesting. So, Shark Tank is a very interesting experience in terms of how you get on the show. So, the way that I did it was I was reading an article and it said they were doing Shark Tank auditions nearby. And it just kind of clicked in my head. And I said, well, I have a small business and I'd love to expand it online and expand it to more cities. And it would be great to partner with a shark and get some exposure. So I went to an audition in New York City, and I think there were about 500 people in line. And as I was late to today's podcast interview, I was late to the audition. And so, of course, I was like the last person in line. And that's just my nature. And so I stood around in New York City for like 8, 9 hours waiting to do this 1 minute pitch to a casting call producer. And, the entire pitch, I said all these amazing things. I said, I've been in the New York Times, I've got $1 million in sales, and nothing impressed the casting call producer. He was totally like stone faced until the very end of my pitch when I pulled my book out and I said, well, and I've published this SAT prep book. And, at this point, I got the publishing deal years later after I had pitched originally, and the book sold 50,000 copies and went #1 on Amazon and all this stuff for SAT prep. But the funny thing was he saw my photo on the back of the book and he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you've written a book. Could I have this book for my nephew to study for the SAT and all this stuff?" And then 2 weeks later, I got a call to, they were flying me out to LA to be on the show, et cetera. But what was so interesting to me is like, you can never connect the dots. Like, I would never have thought that my original plan to have a book would eventually lead me to being on Shark Tank, but it worked out that way, which is I really needed that book to pull out at the end of that pitch to then impress the casting call producer enough to then, get me on Shark Tank, to then eventually getting a deal with Mark Cuban, to getting all this exposure. So it's like all these things, you never know how they are going to connect later. But now I can look backwards and say, well, if I didn't have the book, I probably wouldn't have had Shark Tank. Or if I didn't, pitch all these people, one of the pitches came back later and saw, you're doing well now, so let's give you a deal. So it's so interesting how it all connects.
Sure. How'd you feel when the doors opened and you were on?
Man, you know what's so interesting? I probably prepared for Shark Tank like I prepared for the SAT, which is I prepared hundreds of hours. I prepared all these like, stories and prepared answers for what they're going to ask me. And then as soon as the doors open and I walk down, I like forget everything.
You
It's
blanked out?
like, yeah, you totally black out and you're just like, everything is free flowing. It was super interesting because when I got in the tank, they were drilling me with questions for, I want to say like almost an hour and a half. They said I had one of the longest pitches and I was really answering all these questions. And it felt like it was just 10 minutes because that's how time just flies. And on television, they only show, I think they only air about 15 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. So everyone's like, "Well, why are you sweating at the end of your pitch?" And it's like, "It's not because I got nervous in 10 minutes. It's because it's an hour and a half and I'm standing there with no water and, just kind of being grilled by all these billionaires." But yeah, it was an amazing, amazing experience.
Did you go into this hoping that a particular shark would buy into your idea?
Yeah, definitely. So I had actually written down well before, I think before I even pitched the audition, that I would one day be it's kind of like this law of attraction manifestation thing where I said I'll one day be business partners with Mark Cuban. And lo and behold, on the show, every single shark rejects me, including Mark Cuban. And everyone's like, "I'm out, I'm out, I'm out." And at the very end, Mark Cuban says, "Well, if everyone else is out, I'm going to come back in." And so I couldn't believe it. At the end, he comes and we make the deal. And he's been an amazing, amazing investor. We still email. I think he emailed me yesterday. Still email every other week, probably. He does mainly emails, but I do see him once a year, usually at an event. And then he's made so many amazing introductions. From, AI companies to investment opportunities to event. We spoke at the Obama Foundation last year. And yeah, it's just the Mark is the best shark to get because you get access to Mark Cuban directly, but you also get access to the Mark Cuban company's team. And they've helped me from everything from accounting to finance to tech to partnerships. And so it's really, really been an amazing experience.
It sure sounds like it. I've read up on Mark, and in many ways, he seems like the real deal. There is no pretense. He knows a good opportunity. He is very personable. He also seems very humble to me.
Yeah. He is the most down to earth billionaire you will ever meet. He's, like you said, a very straight shooter. He will tell you how it is, whether I have a question. He always, what the cool thing about Mark is I could email him any time of day and he'll respond within like 10, 15 minutes. He checks like, I think he responds to like 1,000 emails a day. It's pretty crazy. But he is very, very humble. Like he doesn't wear fancy clothes, doesn't spend crazy money, and he's still very frugal like he was when he was broke. And I think that's how he stays rich and doesn't, spend his fortunes in silly ways. But very, very humble, always willing to listen to different ideas from every which direction. And doesn't, yeah, I never get the sense that he feels he's better than anyone else.
I believe he once said that his first and main major extravagance was the jet that he bought after selling his first company. But he also loves it.
Yeah, and so he does spend money on things like that, but I think he spends money on the right things, which is like you said, things he loves, like NBA teams, right? It was his passion, hobby. He loved it. It was also an investment. He made a lot of money on it. So it wasn't just something blew money on. He made money on it. And then the jet makes a lot of sense because it saves him a ton of time, right? You don't have to go through TSA. You don't have to go through airport. So even if you're saving a few hours a week, I mean, it adds up when your time is so valuable. Yeah.
I would be remiss in not asking you to, talk a little bit about your product actually. And obviously it's something that you are incredibly proud of and you put so much hard work and effort, which has paid off. What is your product to those of us who are not familiar?
Prep Expert, as I mentioned, we originally started just as a in-person SAT course where, we would teach students in person. We eventually expanded that to 20 cities. Now, with COVID, actually, we shut all of our locations and we're fully online. So we're really an online education company now. So we do live online courses over Zoom, just like you would learn in a traditional, online school or online college. We focus on SAT and ACT. So those are the college admissions exams for US colleges. And I know many people listening are thinking, well, didn't they make SAT and ACT optional? That was true from like 2021 to about 2024, but now most top universities have reinstated the requirements for SATs and ACTs for college admissions. They're also very, very important for scholarships and reducing your cost of college. But to answer your question, basically, we do live online courses for the SAT and ACT. We do one on one tutoring. We do college admissions consulting. We're adding a new service with AI tutoring, which is going to be really, really cool. We're releasing that in a couple of months here. So we basically help high school students get into college, get scholarships, and improve their test scores. The one thing I love about Prep Expert, though, is when students go through our courses and through our tutoring, what's really unique about us is, of course, we help them improve on the test, but what I like to integrate into my courses is strategies on how to succeed in life. So we teach them about goal setting, how to be more productive, how to study more effectively. And many students, now that I've had the company for 15 years, have become doctors, have become working at NVIDIA, Apple, the tech companies, they've become lawyers, et cetera. And they say that the strategies that we've taught them in, high school, they still use to this day. And that's because I've integrated things that I've learned in how to study for, USMLEs and med school and things like that. I integrate that into our courses so that my students can be successful, not only with this one exam, but throughout their life in terms of time management, productivity, studying, because those are all soft skills that most schools don't teach your student.
Dr. Patel, what does being an entrepreneur mean to you?
I think being an entrepreneur to me is means freedom. So it means that you have the freedom to work on what you want, when you want, how you want, and deliver it, in your particular way. And I would say that's very, very unique in a profession where most professions, you are told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, etc. You can have your, certain customizations, but at the end of the day, if you're not the business owner or if you're not the hospital CEO, you have to follow the rules. And so there are no rules with entrepreneurship, barring laws. But it's a lot of freedom and it's creativity in business, which I love.
Right.
The opposite end of that spectrum, I would say, would be like, especially for listeners in this audience, would be being a resident, right? I
Right.
hated residency because there was
Yes.
no
Yes.
freedom.
Same.
There was no freedom. There was just, you listen to your senior resident who listens to the chief resident who listens to the chair and the attending and the chair. And it was this very like military, like bureaucratic hierarchy. And so it was very interesting, like going through residency and med school under that structure. But then on the other side, I had my entrepreneurship. I was like, oh, I really love this. Like I'm the one who makes decisions here and I'm the one who has free, total freedom here. And, whether it succeeds or fails, it's on me, but at least I got the freedom. Right. So that's what I would say. Freedom is probably, if I had to put entrepreneurship in one word, that's the word I would use.
Freedom. What do you not like about entrepreneurship?
The uncertainty. So with, yeah, risk, uncertainty, those are the entrepreneurship comes with freedom, but with freedom comes risk and uncertainty, which is, most people are not willing to take that risk or have that level of uncertainty. They would rather get their W-2 and, get a job and, have a guaranteed income from an employer. And entrepreneurship is very much you eat what you kill. If you don't kill, you don't eat, and so it's very, very different. I will say that I don't recommend, and this is just from my own experience, for people to just dive into entrepreneurship and quit, their day job or quit being a doctor, et cetera. Like I didn't do that. I was still a resident. I still practiced. I still practice today and I still do medicine. I still have, my regular job, but I still do entrepreneur. I still kind of started entrepreneurship on my nights and weekends, and that's the way that I would recommend diving in entrepreneurship until the business is in a position where it either it absolutely needs you, where it's 80 hours a week and you can't do anything else, or the business is generating enough revenue that you can eat, or if you have enough savings, which many doctors do, to live for 6 months, year, 2 years without having to worry about it, then you can dive in, no worries.
Right. And as I'm sure you're aware, we live in an environment where most doctors and most doctors who are finishing residency are becoming employees of
Hmm.
hospital based systems and private equity backed companies. That's certainly the case in anesthesia. And from a personal experience, I was part of a hospital based anesthesia group all the way until around 2010. And I've been on my own since then and independent and just kind of helped various organizations start up anesthesia groups and it's been incredibly rewarding, but I can definitely connect with that feeling of risk. There were definitely moments where I feel like, man, I'm just working so hard at this. And, this thing that I'm looking at, it seems uncertain. Maybe I should just join a hospital based group and just call it a day and just wait for that paycheck at the end of the month.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't drum up that effort anymore. I just didn't want to do it. And at every turn, including starting up this podcast, it was something that I really wanted to do. And as you know, most podcasts, eventually fizzle out and, you don't become a Joe Rogan and it's not typically. But it was a risk that I was willing to take because my goal, and I want to delve into that with you a little bit. My goal wasn't money. My goal was to bring something of value to others and to my community. So, in that regard, where did money fit in terms of your priorities and your core values in terms of starting up this company and your other ventures?
Yeah. I think money is definitely, um, a priority, but it's not the first priority. I'd say the first priority, both with my medical career as well as my entrepreneurship career, the theme has always been helping people. And the reason I say that is my favorite part of, my patients now in teledermatology is like, oh, my rash got so much better. Thank you so much. You solved it. It's gone. Boom. My favorite part of Prep Expert is getting those emails, those text messages from students and parents saying, we improved 200 points on the SAT, 300 points on the SAT. We got into Yale or Harvard or Stanford. We got, $100,000 scholarship, $200,000 scholarship. So it's like, my motto is change your score, change your life. And I think that a lot of times that is true. When you change lives for the better, the money will follow. And I've found that the more change lives I change with my company or dermatology, the money comes, whether that's, because patient volume in dermatology, we're helping the X number of patients, or in Prep Experts case, because we're enrolling more students because other students are telling their friends that, they did so well with these courses, et cetera. So I think that what I'm realizing is my mission is I want to just change lives. I want to help, if Prep Experts specifically, we want to help reduce the cost of college. We're on a $1 billion scholarship mission. We've helped students win 100 million over the past 10 years. So we want to go for 1 billion over the next 10 years. And if we can change lives through that mission, then, I see no limit or cap on the amount of money that we will make in the company or personally. And so it's usually, I would say that's the way you want to approach entrepreneurship or medicine, is think about how you're going to help people change their life for the better, and the money will almost automatically follow.
Question for you. I want to talk a little bit about the predictive value of these standardized tests. I am not a great standardized test taker. I can understand concepts, but when it comes to test taking, and more often than not, when I have to choose between two choices, I will guess the wrong choice. And it is a wonder that I've gotten to where I am with that level of experience. But what if, you know, and I think I can imagine what your answer would be in terms of you are trying to level the playing field, because there's obviously a lot of socioeconomic factors that go into the actual test taking process. It depends on where you grew up, who's at home, are there, six other kids at home, and are you going into an inner city school with, not a lot of resources? How do you respond to that?
So, what's very interesting is when people ask me, like, is the SAT, the ACT, are they good measures of intelligence? I would be the first person to tell you no. They're not, these are not tests that are going to tell you your IQ or how smart you are or whether you're going to succeed in life. All they tell you is how well you studied for the SAT or the ACT or how well you studied for this exam. Now, that does not mean they are not important. They are important for a variety of reasons. One is they're used as college admissions exams. Two is scholarships to reduce your cost of college. But three, I think what a lot of people don't realize about the importance of test preparation and standardized test preparation, what I do is I think it teaches you so many valuable skills. For example, when I studied for the SAT and I locked myself in the library, I had to put away Facebook. I had to not go to the high school party on Fridays or Saturdays. I had to, figure out how I'm going to spend 8 hours on a Saturday, going to the library rather than going to movies with my friends. So all of that is delayed gratification, self control, productivity, how to focus, how to tune out all the social media, YouTube, all that stuff. That's all like extremely valuable because now as an entrepreneur, when I need to focus on my business, guess what I do? I turn off all the social media. I put my phone away. I'm very productive. I'm very focused. And I can trace that all the way back to when I was 15, 16 years old studying in the library, right? And so I learned those soft skills through test preparation. So I actually think standardized tests are going to become more and more valuable than ever for two reasons. One is the act of studying for tests does not require any money. Like, I know that there's some advantage to obviously having tutors and test preparation, but I did it, for free in a library by myself and now, there's free exams and free preparation, and we offer free preparation type as well on top of our paid courses. And so you could the act of being able to focus is so rare these days because of social media that teaching your student how to focus rather than going on TikTok or Instagram is going to be one of the most valuable things you can do for a child because that is going to help them succeed whether they go to be a doctor, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, or anything else in the future. The other reason that I think standardized tests are going to be more valuable than ever in the future is because AI can now help you cheat on everything. And so there's apps now called Cheat on Everything. And that means that, students' grade point averages really aren't a reflection of anything other than maybe how well they used AI. And so I know there are AI detectors, but there are even apps that allow you to write your essays or do your homework that don't get detected, right? So like there's always going to be this cat and mouse game, how much you can. And so standardized tests are the one area where, okay, well, now you're in a testing center with a proctor in front of questions that you actually have to reason with no AI in front of you. Let's see what you have, right? And so I actually think because of AI and because of social media, which are like the two epidemics of the current day, that standardized tests all of a sudden have more importance than they ever did before, which is very, very interesting.
Now, you have a child. How old is your child?
Just 6 months old. He's still
6 months
a
old.
tiny infant. Yeah.
What do you think is going to be the single most important piece of advice you're going to tell your child?
I think, the single most important piece of advice I will tell my child is going to be you never give up and you have to figure it out. It's that self-reliance. I think that that is becoming more and more rare these days where people are looking for, a get rich scheme on Instagram or, the government to bail them out and get rid of their student loans or whatever it may be. It's like there's a lot of reliance on other people to bail you out. And I want to go back to kind of what my dad taught me as a meta example, which is I am going to be self reliant. I'm going to work as hard as I can for as long as I can to get the results that I want.
Great advice.
Yeah. And, I think hopefully I can show that by example rather than because I have a feeling my son's not going to listen to what I say. And so I know he's only 6 months old, but hopefully I could show him an example, like my dad showed me an example that will illustrate that.
Does your wife also work in healthcare or involved in your business?
Yes. So we both work. She works actually in healthcare, but not on the clinical side. So she does M&A and business development strategy for a hospital system. So she's kind of on the almost the business side of healthcare in terms of strategic ways for expansion and things like that.
Now, obviously, you're both highly successful individuals. How do you unplug and connect with such varied interests and engagements with different ventures?
I was thinking a little bit about that, especially because we have a child now. How do you connect as a couple? And there's a lot to balance, right? So, like right now, most of our free time goes to spending time with the baby.
Yeah.
So we do enjoy, taking the baby out to parks or brunch or, doing little activities to the zoo type of thing. So there's that. But then how do you connect and unplug as a couple? I would say making time for date nights. We try to go to things like comedy shows, dinners. We like to play pickleball. So doing activities together that you both enjoy, I think is really, really important. But I will say it's not easy, between all of the different priorities from business to childcare to just day-to-day errands. So I think one thing that's been effective for us is we try to do it at least twice a month right now, which has been effective with the 6-month-old. We used to do it weekly, but hopefully we can get back to weekly. Yeah.
And that will come too. And I say that after having raised 5 kids. So
Oh,
now,
wow. Congratulations.
thank you. So, besides your wife, your parents, and Mark Cuban, who were some influential mentors in your life?
I would say the number one mentor that I have today is actually my business advisor. His name is Henry. And Henry ran a very successful business for, I want to say 20 years, and they had a big exit at the end. And now he's my advisor at Prep Expert on a day-to-day. He helps us with all of the big decisions from a business and strategy perspective. But he's also a great leader and manager. And I would say that anytime I see him interact with myself or other employees, again, I think the theme here is the meta example. I learn more from how I see him interact than ever how he tells me to, do something. And so I think that's probably hopefully the theme that comes out of today's podcast for a lot of audience members is think about the mentors, the parents, the people that have influenced you and what you watched them do rather than what they ever said to you. Because I bet you that has more of an influence than anything.
One of the greatest expressions that I always find myself coming back to is your actions are so loud, I can't hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it.
So beautifully exemplifies that. And I always tell that to, my loved ones and friends. And I said, if you want to know people, look at what they do on a daily basis. That's who they are, not what they say. And It's almost like saying to someone that you love them, but without any warmth or any expressions of care or love. A couple of final questions. Do you ever go to a moment where you think, I really miss just doing medicine and I wish I was going to a clinic every day and taking care of patients in person and all that? Does that thought ever occur to you?
It has, yeah, especially when I first left the clinic, I did miss it. And, that's why I kind of leave the door open where I keep all my board certifications, my license, state licenses. I continue to practice to keep my skills up in a tele way, just in case, somewhere down the line, I do want to return to the clinic. I don't think it would be something I would do full time, but if I could do in a part time capacity, I do miss it. I do miss interacting with patients on a more, I would say, I still interact with patients in a tele, but I think it's more personal and one to one when you're actually in a clinic with someone in the same room.
I tried to do anesthesia via telemedicine, but it didn't work. Well, I'm kidding, of course.
No. Yeah.
But we are almost at the end of our hour together. Is there anything else that you would like our listeners to know about you? You obviously come from such an amazing background and you've achieved so much. Any parting words of wisdom?
Yeah. I think for everyone, I would say, especially if you have listeners in medicine, I would say one, you're doing amazing work. I would say that one of the things that I get from medicine, and one of the reasons I still do it rather than just go all in on business, is there's nothing more gratifying than helping someone improve their health. Like if you can help them with their health, health is the most important thing out of anything else. So, you know, don't forget that. And I'm sure that most physicians or most healthcare providers listening, that's why they got into it. But two, I would say if you're in training or if you're, one of the many providers who's unhappy with where they're at because they're in a bureaucracy or because they are, have a chief or a boss or, someone that they don't do. I would say as someone who started a venture on the nights and weekends, that it is possible to have a brighter future that has freedom for you. And you just need to work at it. And I think you will be successful because doctors make some of the best entrepreneurs because you already have all the right traits. You have the traits to work hard. You have the traits to work on the nights and weekends. You have the traits to be good at communication. You have all the right traits to be a great entrepreneur. You just have to apply yourself. So if anyone's even thinking about it, I would highly recommend it. And I think, that's probably what I would leave you with is you can do it. Even if you think you can't, you can do it. It might not work right away. And actually it won't work right away, let me tell you. But it will work over time.
Those are beautiful words. It reminds me of, again, someone who was highly successful in what they did. And when they were talking about it, they said, I didn't know that I could fail. And it was very meaningful, meaning that they put all of their efforts into it without any knowledge of where that venture could go and just, you know, set the, set the boat sailing and decided to just jump on it and see where it goes without any thoughts about this could fail or, obviously you mentioned that you don't want to get into a situation where you leave your current job and start off something from scratch. You always, you do want to start something as a side gig and just kind of build it to the point where you can eventually make the transition. And that's how a lot of people do it. But those are very wise words indeed.
Yeah, no, and I think even if you fail, you'll learn a lot of important lessons and failure is part of the process. Yeah. So don't be scared to fail.
Dr. Patel, it's been a pleasure having you on my podcast. I feel like we could talk forever about this topic and a lot of other topics of entrepreneurship, medicine, healthcare, and eventually I would love to have you back just to do a deeper dive into your process and how you how you did it. You know what I mean? And obviously we touched on a lot of different things today, but I really appreciate your time and giving me an hour of your time today.
Yeah, no, of course. This was great. You asked great questions, very unique compared to, most podcast interviews. So keep doing the great work.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. That brings us to the end of another episode of All Ask the Questions around here. I'm Dr. Elisha, and I hope today's conversation gave you something to reflect on and perhaps something to smile about. If you enjoy what you heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join us next week for another journey through life's complexities and comforts.